Hello, and welcome to Hedgehog Storytime, where I read my weird original fiction. The following stories are part of the Mayhem Cerebrum project, linked to the playlist in the description below. Yes, you have to read them all. No, that is not a request.
So Jack's a really weird character to try to work with sometimes, because how his dynamic works in the Tea Party is like, even if he's paired with Kay or if he's paired with Bagay, either one of them, he kind of has to be the weirdo in the corner that occasionally makes really fucked up statements, because both Kay and Bagay are just such big characters that like it's hard to get him to do things unless he's on his own, which is good because there's a huge portion of Jack's life that I haven't filled in yet. So we're going to start it on that. So without further ado, here is Jack Acquires a New Coat, Part 1. A thick mist had descended upon the streets of Victoria that night. It curled around the marble statues and wound its way over the cobblestone streets and through the alleys. In this particular part of the city, however, it went largely unobserved. What was usually a bawdy part of town at this time of night, peopled by raucous drunks and whores, was near silent as the grave. For there were mutterings that the Ripper went out on nights like this. If anything, he was a little irritated that they'd called his number like that. Still, here he was, wandering the streets much as was said, though he refused to skulk around as may be assumed. He walked calmly down the empty road, the only sounds the echoes of his footsteps and the tune that he was whistling quietly. He had to click his tongue slightly at the lack of options. It had been much easier to find a target before he'd gotten his work in the paper. Yet there were always some too desperate to let the Ripper keep them from their work. Leaning against a brick wall, her breasts already half out of her corset, heavy makeup caked onto her face, a whore stood smoking a cigarette. The smoke mixed into the fog, making the haze even thicker. She was a bit too young. She might still have time, but she would have to do. He approached her, and she looked up, sighing slightly. 10 bob for a plough in the alley, 30 for a room. She gestured to the building behind her, where a soft yellow glow mingled with the mist through a small window. Though the thought of haggling occurred to him, he brushed away the thought. The longer he was out in the open, the more likely someone would see him, and the constabulary had been getting awfully nosy lately. Of course, they were hesitating putting all that effort in for some whores, but perhaps he'd been too hasty with his work. Too specific. It was just going to get more difficult from here, wasn't it? So he accepted her price, shoved the pounds into her hand, and she led him into the dark damp of the alley. He wasted no time, undoing the top clasp of her corset. Her breasts spilled out, and he grabbed one in each hand, sticking his face between them. She moaned slightly, though it was put on. They always were. But that's when he felt it. Her beating heart. The sound of it aroused him more than any flesh ever could. The horror could have never followed, let alone stop what happened next. For faster than anything, there was a flash of metal, and her moan turned abruptly into a choking sound. After just a second of horrible gagging, her chest was covered in something warm and wet. She was not able to even wonder about it, however, for the light left her eyes and she collapsed into his arms. He adjusted his weight to compensate and to allow him vision out of the alley. The last thing he wanted was observation. Then, after he was sure she was truly dead, he set her down on the slightly muddy ground. Not an ideal location, but it would have to do. It was time for the real work to begin. The next morning was cold and wet, the fog having condensed into a heavy layer of dew come the weak morning sun. This caused the body to rot faster than it should have, and when the morning patrol came upon it, it was already swarming with flies. A look of surprise was carved into her frozen features, and her head was tilted back slightly too far on a neck that had been sliced deeply open. The patrolmen found themselves at quite a loss of what to do, so the luckiest among them ran back to the yard to call in the captain. When he arrived a few minutes later, huffing and puffing in his slightly ill-fitting suit, he just stared down at the whore's body for a minute, as if he could somehow make this situation less worrying. "And you found it just like this?" he asked the patrolman, who nodded vigorously. The captain sighed heavily. "Bollocks," was all he said for a minute, and then added, "That's the fourth one in the last 2 weeks," under his breath. "So it's true then, Captain," came a sudden, out-of-breath voice from behind them. The men turned, only to be confronted by a petite woman, her skirt and suit jacket askance. She had rushed over so fast that she hadn't even put on a coat. "What are you doing here, Aberline?" The captain sighed. Adela Aberline took a few deep breaths before answering. "I came running as soon as I heard, sir," she explained. "Do you think it's the work of the Ripper?" The captain swiveled around, making sure there were no gawkers to overhear. "Not so loud," he hissed. "Do you want to cause panic?" "Sorry, sir." He sighed again, deeper this time. "Can't say anything conclusive yet." "You've said that about the last 2 bodies, sir." "I hadn't finished." The captain looked a little irritated. "I bet the Saint's knickers that's exactly what we're looking at." "Respectfully, sir, has an investigator been assigned to the case yet?" "Oh, just niced every week. 2 or 3 wasn't necessarily impressive." Aberline clicked her tongue. "But now 4 with identical methodology." He pursed his lips. "We're going to have to now. There'll be an uproar otherwise." "Sir, if I might suggest—" "I'm not putting a rookie inspector on a serial case, Aberline." "It doesn't have to be the whole affair, but at least let me investigate this body, sir. Then you don't have to announce it as serial, after all." He thought about this for a second. The bishopry would not be pleased to hear that they dawdled so much on a serial case, but if he didn't have to announce that it was such, if he could keep this investigation quiet, and it as quickly as possible. "All right," he said finally, "but only because we're spread so thin right now. Use whatever methods you need, just get this case solved. We don't want any more panic than there already bloody is." "Thank you, sir. You won't regret this." She beamed. He was already regretting it. The holding cells always surprised her with how quiet they were. One would think some of the men awaiting trial would make more noise, at least the ones in the drunk tank. But the only sounds were the occasional cough and the flicking of the guards' cards as they played to pass the time. Aberline was quite familiar with the holding cells. New inspectors spent nearly the first month in their position assigned to guard them. The senior inspectors always said it was so that they'd get a good idea of the sorts of scum they'd be dealing with, but Aberline was pretty sure they just didn't want to do it. Her own tenure here had just recently ended, so most of the criminals awaiting trial were still the same ones that she'd had to deal with. She sent the guards out for a cigarette. They weren't supposed to have breaks like this, but they weren't about to question it. Then she started making her way down the row of cells. It was damp and dark, and the walls and floors were a rather off shade of brown. It was the best way to hide how disgusting they probably were. There were cells on both sides of her, creating a pathway in between them. 1 or 2 of the prisoners, the ones she didn't know mostly, glanced her way in interest. There weren't many female inspectors of the yard, so she always found herself a bit of an anomaly. But she was able to ignore them, mostly. Aberline kept her eyes on her destination, the cell at the very back of the row. Due to the lack of illumination, it was impossible to tell who was behind those thick, rusty bars, at least until her eyes adjusted properly. Yet she could still feel eyes upon her. "Is that you, Aberline?" asked a voice from the darkness, hoarse from disuse. "Quite obviously." She shook her head, squinting to try to make him out. "I didn't think you'd go blind after only a month in here, Jack." The man in the cell, sitting with his back against the wall on the hard cot, laughed then. Aberline had never liked his laugh. It sounded a bit like he was choking on razor blades. "Nah," he said. "Just hadn't seen you in a while. Thought they might have sacked you." She also didn't like how easy he was to talk to. Quite the opposite, actually. I've been given a big case. "Really?" He leaned forward, suddenly interested. "You wouldn't happen to be chasing the Ripper, would you?" "How do you know about that?" Her eyes narrowed. Jack shrugged. "Bloke in the next cell over got here about 3 days ago. He told me about it." Aberline turned, and indeed the man in the cell to her left nodded and smiled toothlessly. "Honestly, I'm a little miffed about the whole thing. I thought I was the nastiest bastard around, but not even a month later that this blighter comes along slicing up holes and ripping out their hearts. How in the bloody fuck am I supposed to compete with that? I mean,
the sheer drama of it all.
You're probably hoping we catch him soon then, huh?
Might be nice.
Jack shrugged, trying to come off as indifferent, though Aberline could tell he was curious. That would also be the word that Aberline would use to describe their relationship. Most criminals spent at most maybe 2 weeks in these cells. They either went to trial or got bail by that point. But Jack Steele was a strange case. There was simply no record of him. Anywhere. It was a little hard to prosecute someone who didn't exist. So the judiciary was still figuring out what exactly to do with him. He'd been brought in a few days after Aberline had been assigned to the cells, and he'd been the only constant presence for the last month of duty, so boring as to be almost torturous. Spend that amount of time in the same room with someone, and you end up talking. Of course, Aberline didn't quite view him as a person. He'd knifed about 3 people before they'd finally caught him, but in his more lucid moments, she found him to be considerably more intelligent than most of the inmates that came through here. Well, she sighed, I might be a little over my head on this one, I think.
How many stiffs?
Jack asked, tilting his head. 4. She admitted. Newest one was found just this morning, but that's technically the only one I have access to.
I thought you said the case was yours.
As much as it is a case at all, the captain's not treating them as serial. He just wants the whole affair closed with a little fuss.
They're only whores after all.
Aberline gritted her teeth at that, but ignored the comment. But I was told to use whatever means necessary.
Ah, I see now.
Jack nodded.
So that's why you're here. Come to pick my brain, have you? Ask me where I would strike next to some bollocks like that.
Not quite, she muttered, approaching the bars. I'm actually here to make a deal with you. This is my very first case. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I must solve it. So to that end, I'd like your cooperation.
What do you mean?
I'll let you out. And if you don't run and help me solve this case, then you're a free man, as long as you promise to leave Victoria at once and never come back. Jack just stared at her for a moment, and then laughed.
Can you even do that?
He asked. Technically, no, she admitted. Realistically, yes. Besides, according to our records, you're literally nobody. I'm sure they'd all secretly be overjoyed if you just disappeared. He shook his head in disbelief.
Sorry, but I'm just fucking flabbergasted. Why me, exactly, of all the bloody people in the whole world?
Well, there's the obvious, for one. You think like him in a way that no one at the yard can. You've been on his side of the law. For another, when you're not going on about crochet with intestines, I actually think you might be slightly intelligent.
But there's got to be more to it than that,
Jack insisted. She looked down for a second. You're the only one I know to ask. It's like you said. No one cares about a few whores. He looked like he wanted to continue questioning her, but then he looked back at her again and thought better of it.
All right then, love.
He stretched a little, his shoulder joint cracking loudly.
It's better than rotting away in a cell, I suppose. Plus, I don't like copycats. So let me just finish up in here and let's look at the body, eh?
Finish up? What are you doing?
Cutting myself.
What?
Well, does it look like there's anybody else to cut up around here? What do you expect me to do, papier-mâché?
He waved his arms around in exasperation, and as they caught the light, Aberline could indeed see row upon row of thin red lines dripping down onto his rolled-up sleeves. She grimaced. I'm going to have to get a bandage for those. The sky was that gray, almost white color that always appears before snow, yet there was no sign of any yet. Jack blinked as his eyes adjusted to the light, and he arched his back as he stretched. Must have been hard being stuck in that cell for so long, Aberline commented, trying to make conversation. But Jack just snorted.
Believe me, he grinned. I've had worse.
She managed to scrounge up his jacket from a bin somewhere in the cell's storage. It was shorter than most and made of a material that she thought might be leather. She had never seen one quite like it, and it was so thin that she imagined he still had to be cold, especially here in the back streets with no light or other warmth to speak of. but it was for the best they stay out of sight on their way to the crime scene.
I'm surprised you haven't tried to run yet.
She hadn't quite realized she'd said that out loud until she'd actually done it. He was still stretching out his various stiff appendages as they walked.
Why would I?
Because you're a bloodthirsty maniac who's just been given a golden opportunity to wreak havoc again scot-free?
Well, I suppose that's true.
He shrugged.
But this whole detective business seems fun. Maybe I'll learn some tips about how not to get caught in the future, eh?
Fantastic. Aberline sighed. He then pushed his sleeve down a little to examine the bandages in one of his arms.
Besides, I'm actually in a pretty bloody decent amount of pain right now. I doubt I'll get very far.
But before she could retort, they had rounded a corner to find themselves back at the crime scene. The patrolman put on guard there looked antsy, and his expression became all the more vivid when he saw them. Bad luck. He'd been one of the men on the scene when they'd taken Jack in. Apparently he still had nightmares about it.
Aberline.
He pointed a shaky hand over her shoulder. She shot a look back to Jack as he grinned at her, pleading he understand to let her handle this. He grunted, but turned away.
What is he?
The patrolman stuttered out.
She was going to have to get used to this.
He's helping me, she said firmly. The captain said to use whatever means necessary, and he has. They both glanced over to where Jack was now squatting over the corpse. He was sniffing one of its limp arms.
Obvious experience in the matter. He's not even in handcuffs.
The patrolman's eyes widened.
He's going to kill someone as soon as you turn your back.
I'm keeping an eye on him. She frowned. And if you breathe a word of this to anyone, I'll make sure to let slip to the captain about your opium habit. That shut him up, though he still wouldn't take his eyes off of Jack.
Oi, Aberline.
Jack called out to her, and she shot the patrolman one more hard look before approaching the body. Find something?
Just bear in mind, he began, the only experience I have with bodies is cutting them up.
The look on his face made her stomach churn.
But here.
He lifted the blood-hardened fabric of what was left of her corset with his bare hand, and now Aberline did almost barf. There was a huge empty cavern where the center of her chest used to be. Jack poked a sawed-off segment of rib.
These cuts are bloody clean,
he commented.
The ripper knew exactly where on the ribs would be easiest to cut through. Also what side of the chest the heart was on.
Side?
The heart's never in the exact center, you see, he explained. One rib's bigger than the other to accommodate. He's good enough he knew which one it was at a glance.
Which means we're looking for someone who's used to cutting flesh. Aberline nodded.
A butcher or a doctor, maybe an alchemist.
Jack nodded.
A butcher if I had to guess. He killed her with one cut.
Now he moved aside a few tresses of the corpse's hair to reveal what was left of its neck.
Right to the jugular. Must have bled out within a minute or two. Pretty painless, all things considered.
So he wanted it quiet and quick.
Possibly.
He shrugged.
Personally, I think he just don't like killing much.
What on earth are you talking about?
If she'd been alive when he sawed her ribs open, there'd be some struggle. Won't get it clean through like this, even if he was an expert. No other cuts or bruises either. He only cut her the one time, killed her as quick as possible, and didn't so much as touch her until after she was dead. See, I'd never leave a body this clean. The less recognisable the better, I say. But then again, I don't really care what happens after they're dead. He clearly does.
I'm familiar with your work, but by the saint, how do you know all this? He chuckled, almost a little sheepish.
Like I said, I've got bloody loads of experience.
Then he looked away from her.
Also used to know someone who was really into this sort of shite.
Aberline blinked a few times, honestly surprised. She didn't know exactly what she'd been expecting from him, but it certainly wasn't this. Jack was sharp. Sharper than she'd imagined even after talking to him for a month. She hadn't been quite sure what she was getting herself into, so it honestly came as a bit of a shock to her that this might actually work.